The Wise Man's Fear is the second novel in the Kingkiller Chronicle, and like book 1, it's filled with interesting clues and details that you may have missed. Now, these in-depth summary videos are the perfect primer before diving into all my other Kingkiller content on the channel. Also, I hope they act as a good resource for those who love theories, and you're free to leave all your theories in the comments so that we can discuss. If you missed my summary videos for the first book, The Name of the Wind, then make sure to go watch those first. Ever since making those two videos, I've had countless comments asking me to make summaries for The Wise Man's Fear, and I'm happy to say it's finally that time. Now, the Kingkiller Chronicle is all about the small details, so this is not going to be a quick summary. I'm going chapter by chapter to summarize the book, so it's going to be split up into 3 separate videos, which is fitting because 3 is an important number in this series. Now, I'm going to be mentioning some clues and theories along the way. This video is a massive task to make, but I hope you guys enjoy it. It's sort of a love letter to the Kingkiller Chronicle. Now, all I ask is for your patience as I give a quick word from today's sponsor. I have not been able to stop playing Hyper Fever. This is the most mobile of mobile games. You can build a unique character from a preset selection. It is a real-time card strategy MMO that is literally the best FPS city builder I've ever played. Wait a minute, hold up. This game is not real, but I'll tell you what is real. This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. If you happen to live under a rock and you don't know what Raid is, which, let's be honest, I'm sure most of you have heard of Raid Shadow Legends, this is a free-to-play immersive RPG with stunning graphics and engaging storylines. There's over 650 champions to collect and billions of ways to customize them. Billions! You can build your dream team, battle other players in PvP, and you can challenge powerful bosses. Did I mention that everyone's playing it? Raid Shadow Legends has over 80 million players worldwide. Now, the first episode to Raid Call of the Arbiter is out now. To celebrate this awesome new limited series, Raid is adding some of the new characters from the series as champions in the game, which is so cool. And one of them, the fearsome orc warlord Artak, is going to be available to everyone just by logging into Raid for 7 days between now and July 24th. If you've seen episode 1, you'll know who Artak is. I don't want to spoil anything here. All I'm gonna say is that you should go watch episode 1 and all will be revealed. New players, you can use my link or scan the QR code right here to get a free starter pack with all this cool in-game loot. If you haven't played it yet, what are you doing? Once you're in the game, you can find me under the nickname The Chronicler. You can join my clan and we can be legends together. So just use my link in the description and I'll see you in game. And a big thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring another video. Prologue, a silence of 3 parts. The Wise Man's Fear begins at dawn, only a few hours since the last book ended, and here we see a silence of 3 parts again. The first part is things that were lacking, a storm, travelers, and of course, music. And the second is the silence of a man sneaking down the basement stairs. Specifically, this man is Bast. And then of course, the third belongs to Kvothe, who is lying in bed but has long ago forgotten any hope of sleep. It's the patient cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. Now, it's interesting how Kvothe can no longer seem to sleep, and he's also waiting to die. Is it just me, or does this remind you of Haliax, how he can no longer sleep or die? He's denied entry to the 4 doors of the mind. Now, I don't know if Kvothe becomes like a Chandrian, or if he just did something that barred him access to the 4 doors. Now, chapter 1 then begins with Bast preparing the inn. Kvothe enters the room and says they need to talk about what Bast did last night. Bast is thinking he's been caught threatening the Chronicler, a scene you may remember from the very end of The Name of the Wind when he snuck into the Chronicler's room and viciously threatened him. However, Kvothe is referring to how Bast saved the inn by stopping the creature from beyond the mail. Now, Kvothe suggests that they could make things safer around here by doing something from a song called The White Rider's Hunt, and he sends Bast off to do it. Later on, Chronicler arrives in the main room, and Bast returns with holly branches meant to keep the skin dancers from taking over their bodies. Bast then scares the Chronicler by pretending to be possessed by a dancer. He then gives the Chronicler a holly crown, and they end up in a heated discussion where Bast reminds the Chronicler that he's under his watch until he can pull Kvothe out of his state. Aaron, the smith's apprentice, comes by for some traveling food as he and Carter are going to enlist in the army since they give a whole gold mark. There's mention of rebels who are rebelling against the penitent king. Now this is a really interesting detail here. Penitent means feeling or showing sorrow and regret for having done something wrong. Repentant. So we know that Kvothe kills a king, and now this new king, whoever he is, has done something wrong and has repented of it. Now Aaron gives some details on what he's heard about Kvothe. He knew all sorts of secret magics, including 6 words he could whisper in a horse's ear that would make it run 100 miles. This seems to be a reference to his journey to Traben, and also to the 7 words that he keeps saying to Denna. Aaron says Kvothe could turn iron into gold and save lightning in a quart jar, both of which could actually be possible with sympathy and sigildry. He knew a song that would open any lock. Now I wonder if this could be hinting that music is needed in order to open the 4-plate door in the archives. Music being the key is a theory I've mentioned in previous videos. He could stave in a strong oak door with just one hand. Now this was likely spread by bystanders at Ambrose's inn when Kvothe used a sage stone to break in the door. He rescued some girls from a troop of ogres once. This story likely spread from the 2 girls that he saved from the fake Rue troop. He stole secret magics from the university. That's why they threw him out, you know, and they didn't call him Kvothe Kingkiller because he was good with a lute. If only Aaron knew. He then goes on to describe just how terribly clever Kvothe was. And the innkeeper says, "So if you were Kvothe, and terrible clever, as you say, and suddenly your head was worth 1,000 royals and a duchy to whoever cut it off, what would you do?" Well, if I were Kvothe, I'd fake my death, change my name, and find some little town out in the middle of nowhere. Then I'd open an inn and do my best to disappear. He looked at the young man. That's what I do. Now surprisingly, Kvothe goes on to tell Aaron who he actually is, that he is Kvothe, and offers to let Aaron hear his story as long as he doesn't go and enlist. "I can tell you stories no one has ever heard before, stories no one will ever hear again, stories about Felurian, how I learned to fight from the Adem, the truth about Princess Ariel." But Aaron doesn't believe him. He thinks he's just making fun and asks to see his cloak of no particular color, which we know is actually Taborlin's cloak. Aaron then mentions that Kvothe has a silver sword called Caesara the Poet Killer. This line has led many fans to believe that Kvothe will end up killing Ambrose with his sword. Or there's a darker theory that he ends up killing Sim. Aaron then quotes a poem about Kvothe's rings. "On his first hand he wore rings of stone, iron, amber, wood, and bone. There were rings unseen on his second hand. One was blood in a flowing band, one of air, all whisper thin, and the ring of ice had a flaw within. Full faintly shone the ring of flame, and the final ring was without name." Now at the university, they make rings to show mastery over a name. We see Fela make a ring of stone after she learns the name of stone. This would imply that Kvothe has mastered the names of iron, amber, wind, ice, and fire, and possibly blood. The rings of bone and wood come from his time in the mayor's court later in the book. The ring of blood could refer to a son who brings the blood, meaning he's of lackless blood. And then there's the ring without name, which is really hard to speculate on. Though I do believe this ring could be made of copper. It's hinted at in the books and by Rothfuss outside of the books that copper is nameless, and namers can't control it. That's why there's copper infused in the walls of Haven. Aaron ends up leaving, and failing to convince him, Kvothe resumes telling his story to Bast and the Chronicler. And finally, Chapter 3 brings us back to the story, where we see that he's waiting in line for admissions to the new semester. Fela confesses that Elodin has invited her to join his class. Will reminds him he's still banned from the archive, and he sells Kvothe his time slot. Now later on, Kvothe goes to the fishery to make magical items to make a bit of profit, and after stopping by his room at Anchor's, he brings some food over to Auri. He says he's afraid the potatoes are cold, and Auri says, "Don't be afraid, I'm here," which is adorable. She then goes on to say she has an apple that thinks it's a pear, and a bun that thinks it's a cat, and a lettuce that thinks it's a lettuce. Now Auri leads him through the tunnels of the Underthing and carries with her some small object that gives off a greenish light. She leads him to a back way into the archives so he can study for admissions. Now later on, he goes to the Aeolian with Will, Sim, and Manette. We get a couple more lines of the Jackass song that he wrote in Book 1, but Kvothe says he's done with Ambrose. Spoiler alert, that doesn't age well. We learn that he used all the talents he received from Ambrose breaking his lute to purchase a new expensive one and pay off his debt with Devi, leaving him no money for tuition. Now he then goes looking for Denna, and surprisingly he actually finds her, though she's going by the name Diniel. She's dressed in silk and jewels and is with a gentleman named Kellen who's teaching her the harp. Now this man mentions that a lute is for folk music, and it's clear that Kvothe is jealous of this man who's both rich and has a voice like honey over warm bread. Denna pretends to drop an earring so she can have a moment alone with Kvothe, and then after, Kvothe decides to head to the stage. He prepares his new lute, which he loves, though knows that it has flaws. Anyone can love a thing because that's as easy as putting a penny in your pocket. But to love a thing despite, to know the flaws and love them too, that is rare and pure and perfect. Considering he takes a glance at Denna, it's likely that he's thinking about her. He then plays a simple folk tune called Bellwether, which he pretends is difficult, and then a very hard piece called Tin Tanta Torin and plays as if it's boring and easy. While some patrons feel tricked, he amuses the other musicians. Then after, Sim mentions that Ambrose is 13th in line for the throne of Vintas after an entire family was lost at sea. Ambrose is barely a dozen steps from being king, which along with the poet killer mention has made many fans speculate that Ambrose is the king that Kvothe kills. Manette asks him a question about spades, which is oddly asked again later on by Elodin during admissions. Could this indicate that Manette is working as a spy for Elodin, or is even Elodin in disguise? Who knows? On the morning of his admissions interview, Kvothe begins to worry. A woman approaches and buys him a drink for breaking Ambrose's arm the semester before, but she's wearing gloves and she gets the mug wet, and when he touches it and suddenly smells the smell of nutmeg and plum, she bursts into tears and flees. With the poison activated, the first mistake Kvothe does is buy a pie and almonds when he needs every penny. He talks super loud and obnoxious while in the line, and he insults Ambrose, who simply smiles and says, "Don't fancy plum," before walking away. He runs to Sim's room and seriously threatens to kill Ambrose, even going so far as to pick up a knife. Sim realizes that Kvothe has been drugged with a mixture that makes him lose his inhibitions. The drug takes 8 hours to wear off and will likely have bad side effects, so he gets Fela to trade him her admission slots. Kvothe, having no filter, tells Fela that he'd give everything he owned besides his loot if he could just look at her naked for a few minutes, which makes Sim and Fela blush. 6 hours later, Sim takes him back to his room at Anchors, where Kvothe is overwhelmed with childhood memories. Auri enters through his window and holds him while he sobs, and she says the same thing she said earlier, "I'm here, you're safe." Over the next several days, he experiences plum echoes, which cause overwhelming bouts of emotion. While walking to the fishery, he runs into Master Elodin, and Elodin challenges Kvothe to prove that he's worth teaching. "Prove you're worth teaching. Shake my assumptions down to their foundation stones." Before giving reasons why he doesn't want to teach him, because Kvothe is too eager to be properly patient, he's too proud to listen properly, and he's too clever by half. That's the worst of it. Master Hem shows up and insults them both, then Elodin gets Kvothe to pick the lock to Hem's rooms and set his clothes on fire. He gets his revenge on Hem and also proves his point to Kvothe. Now later, Kvothe enters his admissions interview with the university's 9 masters. Elodin asks the same question that Manette did about spades in exactly the same words. Then he also asks, "Where does the moon go when it's no longer in our sky?" This is a question that likely only a namer would know. The moon goes into the Fae, but Kvothe doesn't know this yet. Things go smoothly until Hem accuses Kvothe of setting fire to his rooms and uses the Adema Ru slur Ravel, causing Kvothe to snap. Kvothe teaches the masters the etymology of the slur before being dismissed while they discuss his tuition, which ends up being set at 9.5 talents, which is much more than he can afford. After this, he visits Denna, gifting her some herbal asthma medication, which is a very thoughtful gift. She plays the harp for him, and the inn has a magic bell that rings downstairs when Denna rings it upstairs. She gets excited when she realizes that sigildry is a magic where you write things down, and she asks how it works, but their drinks come before Kvothe can answer. Later on, he plays his lute for Auri and they exchange gifts. She gives him a lavender candle for happy dreams, a kiss on the forehead, and the promise that he can live with her in the Underthing for safety if he needs it. Is this foreshadowing? I think so. Now it's interesting that Auri has given him a key, coin, and candle, which are the same magical artifacts that Taborlin the Great was known to possess. Also, at one point, Auri says she's as lovely as the moon, which I think is worth noting as there seems to be a lot of connections to her and the moon. Also, Eax played his flute and the moon came to him, and Kvothe plays his lute and Auri comes to him. Now, Elodin actually shows up and gifts Auri a Sinus fruit, and it's important to note that later on in the book, Felurian says that giving a single Sinus fruit is considered a terrible offense to one of the Belladari. And as we see, Auri's reaction to Elodin's gift is telling. She gives him only 1 serving of beer, not 2 like she gave to Kvothe and herself. Kvothe wonders idly if Auri felt that Elodin had slighted her in some way. So what is a Belladari? I'm not really sure, but Belani is the address of the university, and the remains of the ancient city of Bellin is likely the Underthing below the university. So maybe Belladari refers to people of Bellin, as Auri is a resident of the Underthing, which could be Bellin, but that's just my guess. When Auri briefly leaves, Kvothe desperately explains the rules of interacting with her and begs Elodin not to tell anyone about her. She returns with a blanket, they share dinner, and Kvothe realizes that the two of them know each other. Kvothe then calls Auri the name he gave her, and Elodin is intrigued and says that it suits her. He walks back with Elodin, and Elodin swears on my mother's milk, on my name and my power, by the ever-moving moon, that he won't tell anybody about Auri. He asks why he gave her the name Auri, and Kvothe says it means sunny, but he doesn't remember in what language. Elodin then invites him to join his class on naming, but when he learns that Kvothe is still banned from the archives, he takes him to the Master's Hall, and Elodin confronts Master Loren and gets Kvothe access to the archive with the promise of cutting off his thumbs if he transgresses again. The next day, Kvothe signs up for classes, including Elodin's Introduction to Not Being a Stupid Jackass. Later, Kvothe works in the fishery and is called to Master Kilvin's office. Kilvin tells Kvothe a woman was asking for him, claiming that he sold her a magical charm, and such charms are false and against the school policy. Kvothe successfully explains that he's innocent. At Elodin's class, the Master reinforces how complex names are and how the sleeping mind knows more than the conscious one, then gives them a strange list of books to read. And over the course of several days, Kvothe realizes the books that Elodin has assigned them are not about naming. He notices the words chiseled into the massive doors to the archives read Vorfelin Renata More, which Willem roughly translates to the desire for knowledge shapes a man. It's interesting this is a loose translation. Could it actually mean shapers desire knowledge? I don't know, but I feel like there's something here. Somebody, likely Ambrose, wrote Rue Bastard in the ledger next to Kvothe's name, but Kvothe just smiles and says that's correct. In his next naming class, Elodin doesn't show up and instead leaves a note for the students to discuss their readings. Now back in the archive, Kvothe begins to think of the archive as a city. There's bad neighborhoods where the system of organization has broken down, and it's here that Kvothe secretly searches for books on the Chandrian, but he doesn't find much other than fairy tales. Now he does find a book called the Book of Secrets, with each page having a picture of some fairy tale creature. However, the entry on the Chandrian is the only one without a picture. It just has decorative scroll work. And it oddly says the Chandrian never fight and never cuss. In fact, they are quite nice to us. Now, a small detail that I think is really important is that later it's mentioned that the Amir are known to hide hidden messages within scrollwork. So I think there's some real details about the Chandrian hidden in this scrollwork. Back in naming, Elodin shows up this time and he starts the session by demanding the students tell him interesting facts. One of the weird facts given that stands out is that Yillish knots are the oldest written language. Again, this makes me think of the scrollwork in the book and what it could be hiding. Kvothe's fact is that the Adem have a secret art called Lethani, but he doesn't know what it is because it's secret. Then to demonstrate learning the name of the wind, Elodin chases milkweed fluff around the room until he falls and cuts himself. He seems to be trying to help open up their sleeping mind, though his methods are very questionable. At the end of the day, Kvothe searches for Denna only to find her with Ambrose. His mind is reeling from seeing the two of them together, and he buries his head in books to try and distract himself. He's seen her with a lot of men, but the fact that it's Ambrose really upsets him. He finds another book that has a brief mention of the Chandrian that says that most people believe if you talk to them, they come for you. They appear and commit diverse violence for no clear reason. There are signs which herald their arrival, but there's no clear agreement as to these. Blue flame is the common, but I have also heard of wine going sour, blindness, crops withering, unseasonable storms, miscarriage, and the sun going dark in the sky. Chapter 17 gives us a brief pause in the story as Kvothe sees Old Cobb enter the Waystone Inn, shortly followed by the smith's prentice and Carter, the three toast to Shep, the man who died the night before while fighting the monster. Aaron tries to toast to the king, but instead Kvothe gives the toast to old friends who deserved better than they got. Now, I'm not sure if this is referencing Sim, I'm not sure who else, but I really hope nothing bad happens to Sim. Anyway, the men leave and the story resumes. At the Aeolian, Will, Sim, and Kvothe play corners with Denna, who pretends like she's never played, but ends up beating all of them. She asks them questions about how magic works, and eventually they explain to her sympathy, the process of creating a bond between different objects, and the strength of will that enables them to, known as Alar. They also explain the dangers of sympathy like malfeasance. Now, Denna mysteriously asks if there's a magic where a person writes something down that then becomes true for whoever reads it. And I believe this is sort of the start of her interest in Yillish knots. As we see later in the book, it seems like she's doing some sort of magic with the braids in her hair. Now, something to note is that while she's asking these questions, she's also tracing patterns on the table. But none of the boys have heard anything about this type of magic. Kvothe and Denna go for a walk, and he puts his cloak around her, but he realizes that her ring is missing. She says Ambrose offered to have the fitting repaired, and that she only went out with him a few times, but that the ring is really important. And of course, Kvothe offers to get it back. Now, I wonder if Ambrose noticed her ring had Yillish knots on it and was trying to investigate it for some reason. He is a vintage noble, so he knows how rings can hold power or control. Anyways, Kvothe lures Ambrose out of his rooms by slipping a note under his door at the Golden Pony. He then breaks in through his window with Sim and Will acting as lookouts. As he searches the room, I love that he causes mischief, like weakening the seams on Ambrose's pants so that the next time he sits down, they'll split. Will warns him that Ambrose is back, and Kvothe discovers that the window was aligned with sigildry, alarming Ambrose of his presence and sealing shut. He quickly jams the keyhole to prevent Ambrose from entering and breaks the ward on the window. As he leaves, he cracks a tile and falls to the ground, and is hit by a falling tile. And back in his room, his friends notice that he's bleeding from a gash on his back, and Sim stitches him up while Will warns him about his feelings for Denna. The next day, Kvothe goes to work in the fishery, and again he's warned that there's a girl looking for him that says he sold her a charm. He helps Kilvin work on a project, and at one point Kilvin swears in Shaldish, Kist Krail en Coat, and we know that Coat means disaster. Kilvin says he wants him to work on more complicated projects, and Kvothe agrees but ends up passing out from the heat. He wakes up in the Medica where Mola diagnoses him with an acute case of jumping out a window. She doesn't like Ambrose either, so she doesn't tell anyone. Will and Sim arrive, and they talk about the way that Kvothe's eyes change color and how it's not worth arguing with him when they're dark green. In his advanced sympathy class, Kvothe learns about slippage, which occurs when a sympathist channels so much heat that they raise their body temperature to dangerous levels, and they can be left with brain damage from fever or even cook themselves from the inside out. Master Elk-Sadal creates competitions and duels for the students where Kvothe keeps winning, and here he says that his Alar was like a blade of Ramston steel. However, Dal warns him about taking care of himself when he learns of Kvothe's heat exhaustion. They then discuss naming in Elodin's class, and Elk-Sadal lights a fire by calling the name of fire. He then places his hands in the hot coals to show that he has mastery over it. After class, Kvothe goes to the Aeolian and talks with Count Threpe. He asks about Denna's strange patron, Master Ash, but Threpe doesn't know of anyone like that, and he finds it very odd. Kvothe then walks home and is overwhelmed with heat. He jumps into the river to cool himself down, but goes home terribly afraid of his symptoms. At Anchors, he tells his friends about the heat, and Sim thinks it could be an after effect of the Plum Bob. Kvothe performs the lute for a few hours, but then experiences intense chills, so bad that Will has to help him get upstairs to his room, where he does dangerous sympathy involving using a candle to restore his temperature. He reveals that he has a burn on his chest and then suddenly starts gushing blood from a sudden invisible stab wound. They realize that he's experiencing malfeasance. He uses his Alar to fend off incoming mental attacks, convinced that Ambrose must have found his blood on a tile. He then goes to the roof, intending to put his blood on some leaves to become untraceable, like he did in the previous book, but ends up meeting Auri on the roof, who says that he looks like one of the Ciridae. Forgetting that he's not supposed to ask her questions, he asks her how she knows about the Amir, and then in the next flash of lightning, Auri vanishes. He finds her across the roofs where she's crying and says that she doesn't like telling. Kvothe feels horrible for making her cry and apologizes, and Auri says, "You are my Ciridae, and thus above reproach. She reached out to touch the center of my bloody chest with a finger. Iver enim Yuji." Auri then takes him to the Clinks, an underground river in the Underthing with unpredictable flow. They put his blood and hair into bottles and throw them in, ensuring he cannot be tracked by whoever has his blood. Kvothe then goes to stay with his friends. Later, Kvothe tries to get the schema for a gram, a protective amulet, but Master Kilvin says he can only get it when he's Eltha. But Kilvin does agree to give Kvothe a private room with a forge. Kvothe then goes to a very dingy inn to speak to an illegal materials dealer named Sleet to try to negotiate for a gram schema. While he's unable to buy that, he does buy a crossbow using gold and silver that he stole from the fishery. Later, he meets Fela by the four-plate door, and she says that she dreamed Valeritas was an old dead king, and his tomb was behind the door. What do you think is behind the four-plate door? Let me know in the comments. Later, Kvothe goes to visit Devi and he fakes a stumble to steal one of her hairs. He knows that she sold Ambrose the recipe for the Plum Bob, so he asks to see his blood to make sure that it hasn't been tampered with, but she refuses. Kvothe then reveals a Mommet, a wax doll that he made of her that he uses to bind her in place with sympathy. Devi is furious to say the least, and to his surprise, she starts to move, her Alar like an ocean in a storm, which just so happens to be one of the three things that a wise man fears. With her strong Alar and the help of a sigildry device known as a poor boy, a sort of burner providing high energy for sympathists, she's able to win the duel, which means that she's better than any current Relar at the university. And she says the masters feared a woman who could match them in her second year. She then rips out some of his hair and places it in a Mommet and binds him so that he can't move at all. With fury and loathing, Devi explains that she had someone come by looking to buy his blood for 55 talents, but she turned the person away. She feels betrayed and ends their business relationship and demands that Kvothe pay his debt by the end of the term or she'll sell his blood. Now in chapter 27, Sim and Will end up agreeing that it's Ambrose who's doing the malfeasance, as the attacks seem to be coming when he's alone in his room. As time goes by, Kvothe begins to feel exhausted, as he needs to keep up his Alar to fight the attacks that come without warning. And on the 9th day, Fela finally finds the schema for the gram, only it's written in Eld Vintic, which fortunately Sim can read. Also, Kvothe notices that Fela is beginning to fall in love with Sim. He begins working on the gram when he's sure Ambrose is too occupied to attack. Back in his room at Anchors, he's devastated to find that his lute is missing. He feels as if someone stole his heart. He attends naming class, and the master guides the class on thinking about things that are unexplainable. Kvothe is very dense and doesn't really get the point, and after class he's having a hard time coping about his lute as he feels he can't live without music. At Anchors, he finds a note from Denna inviting him to dinner 2 days ago. He searches for her and finds her crying over a letter in a garden. Now, who this letter is from or what it's about, it's never explained. They comfort each other before Denna reveals that she has a surprise for him and takes him to a music shop. And here the shop owner presents to him a strong new waterproof lute case and reveals that he has his lute. Denna had borrowed it to get the case fitted, and she tried to invite him to dinner on the same night so that he'd never know it was missing. In the next chapter, Kvothe walks through the forest north of the university at night. He meets with Mola, Fella, Will, and Sim by a bonfire. He shows off his completed gram, and they test it with a wax doll and a pin. The gram goes cold against the attacks, but nothing gets through. Kvothe can finally put his Alar to rest and get a good sleep. The next night, he returns to the forest with his friends. Fella appears dressed provocatively for a date with Ambrose. Her goal is to distract him. The plan is now set in motion. Mola arrives with Devi, who hates Ambrose and wants to help. Kvothe apologizes to her and they make a temporary truce. Now a little while later at the Golden Pony, someone shouts that there's a fire and smoke is coming out of Ambrose's room. Kvothe breaks into the room using a siege stone he made in the fishery. Ambrose's dresser is on fire from where it contained Kvothe's blood. Kvothe puts out the rest of the fire as Ambrose arrives and yells slurs at him, but the onlookers defend Kvothe. The group meets back at the bonfire to share their stories, and Kvothe reveals that he found the jeweler's slip for Denna's ring, but hides the fact that he stole 6 talents from Ambrose. In the next chapter, he redeems Denna's ring from the shop and sees her emerald necklace that she likely sold to buy his loot case. He looks for her and can't find her. Basically, this entire plotline is kind of like a retelling of the Gift of the Magi. Heading to the fishery, Kvothe spots a girl in a blue cloak who matches the description of the girl who's spreading rumors about him. He recognizes her as Nina, the girl from Traben that he met while searching for information about the Chandrian. Nina's been looking for him and says that she's been dreaming about the Chandrian vase she found in the ruins of the Mothan farm, and believes an angel is giving her the dreams. She gives him a recreation of the images that she saw. Now, interesting detail is when Kvothe saved Traben, he gave Nina a nonsense amulet that he told her would keep her safe from the Chandrian and her nightmares. So it's interesting that now she's having these dreams about the vase. Now he recognizes Cinder with his white hair and black eyes, standing on water beside a bare tree. Then there's Haliax, cloaked in shadow with moons over his head, a mirror at his feet, and 2 candles. One yellow with an orange flame and the other a black candle of shadow. Now the candles could be significant. In the Lackless rhyme, right beside her husband's candle, there's a door without a handle. And of course, Taborlin the Great also has a candle. And there's the candle that Auri gave him. There's another figure that's larger than the others and depicts a member of the Amir. His hand is red with blood, which means he's one of the Siridae, a high-ranking member of the Amir. Kvothe first thinks the symbol he wears is an autumn leaf, but then he realizes it's a burning tower. They were all awful to look at, but he was the worst. I can't get faces right, but his was terrible grim. He looked so angry. He looked like he was ready to burn down the whole world. There are some other figures, including a woman holding a broken sword, and another man with a dog biting his leg, and a woman with some of her clothes off. Kvothe decides he needs to discover more about the Amir, since there's one on the vase which is older than the historical founding of the Amir as part of the church. And of course, Haliax mentioned them as if they are still a threat. Now later, Kvothe, Sim, and Will go drinking to celebrate besting Ambrose, and drunk, they debate the origin of both Greystones and the Amir. Sim thinks that Greystones are pagan relics and ought to be avoided, the opposite of what Kvothe believes, that they mark safe places. They make a bet on who's right to be settled in the archives. Now Kvothe opens up about being a Demaru, and even talks about his parents a bit before reciting a poem that his dad wrote. Now, if you've never picked up on the clue in the poem, the ending, Natali a lot less, is definitely a play on words and meant to sound like Natalia Lackless. Kvothe's mother comes from noble roots, and Natalia Lackless ran off with a traveling troupe, so it's pretty much confirmed that his mother is actually Natalia Lackless. Kvothe then tells Sim a story about Faerinial, a place where all the roads in the world meet. The tale is beautifully poetic, and in the story, a beggar named Sceop goes to 5 different groups of travelers in Faerinial, trying to share a fire and some dinner. However, they all turn him down, including the Amir, who he thought would be generous because they're part of Telu's church. The Amir raises his bloody hands up like a balancing scale, and this is when Sceop notices that the red blood on the Amir is actually a tattoo, marking him a Siridae, meaning that nobody could go against him, for all that he does is in the service of the greater good. Now the beggar then leaves and walks to the center of Faerinial, where he comes across a circle of Greystones, and notices that 2 of the stones are actually Wagons, and here the Ademaru welcome him in as family. They ask him where he's going, and he says Tinue. The Ru say they're going to Belani, which of course is the university. Kvothe then explains to Sim that if you're ever offered wine before water by a traveling troupe, that means they're Ru. The next day, they head to the archives to settle their bets, and they don't find any clear information on whether gray stones are ancient road markers or pagan sites. Though interestingly, one book says they decorated the stones at the equinox but forbade visiting them at the full moon because you could pass through into the Fae. So their bet ends in a draw, and they end up finding contradictory info on the Amir as to whether they were disbanded by the Talon Church or the Emperor. Kvothe is dismayed, but the boys figure there's no better time to introduce him to Puppet. They lead him deep into the archives and knock on a door to reveal a strange tall man who impersonates Taborlin the Great before he lets them inside and starts to immediately make a wooden puppet of Kvothe. Now this man, known as Puppet, lives within the archives, and Kvothe is horrified to see that there's candles everywhere in his room. Puppet appears to be one of the students whose mind likely cracked under the pressure of the Arcanum, though some fans have pointed out that his black robes could indicate that he was previously one of the masters. Puppet mentions how too much looking can get in the way of seeing, which sounds a lot like something Elodin would say. Puppet happens to have an eidetic memory for where all the books in the archives are located, and he also knows about the Amir. He confirms that the church disbanded the Amir, and the boys speculate that the contradictions were the result of intentional blame shifting by historians. While he's talking, he puts on a puppet show in which a Talon priest hits a woman with a book of the path. Kvothe asks Puppet about the 4-plate door, and Puppet mysteriously goes serious and says it shouldn't be of any concern to a student. Now, why do the masters allow Puppet to live deep within the archives and have candles in his room? It doesn't really make sense, but there's a theory out there that Puppet is actually working for Master Lauren. He's one of the Amir, and his job is to be a watchguard for the 4-plate door, which is mentioned to be located 1 floor above his room. Now, maybe when Puppet's candles turn blue, he knows to sound the alarm. But again, that's just a theory. I've also heard some fans mention about his puppet show that it could be symbolizing Denna's patron beating her, and that her patron is a Talon priest or maybe a member of the Amir. If you have any theories on Puppet, make sure to leave them in the comments. Now, chapter 41 brings a bit of a time jump. It's now winter and most of the term has gone by, and the archive is packed with students studying. Kvothe and Sim are in tomes, and Kvothe shows him a medical diagram from a book written by the Duke of Gibeah. Sim is horrified by the book and explains that Gibeah was a monster who conducted terrible medical experiments on live subjects. While the Duke was likely an Amir himself, eventually the Amir moved against him and found the bones of 20,000 people on his property, women and children. Kvothe counters Sim by saying that when the Amir burned his estate, 4 of his volumes concerning the machinery of the body were lost, which was a great loss for science. Now, this is very much like an ethical debate we'd see in real life, but surprisingly, Kvothe doesn't quite understand the genuine ethical problem, even after he learns that Sim's family lived 30 miles from the Duke, and likely some of those bones came from his family. Now, hidden in some decorative scrollwork in the book are the words Ivar Imim Yuj, which is Tema for the greater good, the motto of the Amir. Around this time, a lot of the Amir had grown quite corrupt, and it's likely that the Duke was one of them. Now, right when Kvothe is thinking this means there could still be a secret order Amir out there, Master Lauren shows up to suspend him for 5 days, as Kvothe had earlier chased out some students that were being loud and obnoxious when he should have left it to the scribs. Now, if you saw my summary for book 1, you may remember that it's a pretty common fan theory that Master Lauren is one of the Amir, and I think the timing here might be a clue for that. Later, Kvothe forces himself to go see Devi. Devi explains that she didn't know she was making the Plum Bob for Ambrose or that it was used on Kvothe, and they sort of make up. And Devi extends his loan back to the original due date. Now after that, a sailor brings him a letter from Denna, who's in Yil. Now she tells him of her adventure there, how she met an Adem mercenary, and how she's learning the harp. However, the letter is kind of weird. She has oddly placed capitalized words that may be trying to emphasize something, or maybe there's even a hidden code. But this code is never deciphered throughout the book. During his next class, Elodin arrives on time in formal robes and, to everyone's surprise, has brushed his hair. He then announces that Fela has found the name of stone 8 times. And to showcase her ability, she turns a river rock into a ring and is promoted to Relar. Later in the fishery, Kvothe demonstrates to Kilvin his arrow catch invention, a device using sympathy that's capable of stopping a metal bolt from 20 feet away or an arrow from 10 feet away. After chastising him for using an illegally acquired crossbow and for purchasing it with fishery metals, he approves the arrow catcher for sale and pays him for the prototype. Now later on at Anchors, as he gets to the end of a song, 3 constables of the Iron Law and a high-ranking official show up to arrest Kvothe for his display of malfeasance, or in their opinion, demonic powers, to call the name of the wind on Ambrose the semester before, back near the end of the first book. Apparently, being publicly lashed wasn't enough revenge for Ambrose. He's bound hand and foot and taken to Imri for a 6-day trial, and eventually is cleared of all charges. Now the story then breaks to go back to the frame narrative. The chronicler is frustrated that Kvothe is skipping over the details of the trial, but he makes a good point that these details are in the public records, so he doesn't need to waste his time. People come to the inn, chronicler writes down their wills, and food is served. Then chronicler attempts to manipulate more information about Kvothe's trial in Imri by bringing it up with Old Cobb. Kvothe is unimpressed about this, and he begins starting rumors about the chronicler, knowing they'll start to spread. Most of what Old Cobb says about the chronicler is likely false, but there is a little bit of info here about how the chronicler used to be a member of the High King's court in Modeg, he fell in love with the High King's daughter, and now has to give the king something more valuable than the princess, so he travels looking for something. This little piece of info might actually be true. Now after they leave, Kvothe tells the chronicler that he needs perspective on what it's like to have his life in other people's mouths. You go rummaging around in other people's lives, you hear rumors and go digging for the painful truth behind the lovely lies. You believe you have a right to these things, but you don't. When someone tells you a piece of their life, they're giving you a gift, not granting you your due. We then jump right back into the story. Kvothe continues to research the Aemir while preparing for admissions, but is frustrated with the lack of information. He speculates that the Aemir destroyed information about themselves during their last disbandment, and someone has removed or altered the information in the archives. He's too intimidated to tell Lauren about this, and thinks that Master Lauren would be horrified to learn the archives were censored. Though really, I think that Lauren is likely the one who has done it or is heavily involved. Later, Master Elxadal speaks with Kvothe and makes a suggestion about him taking a break and shares a story called The Ignorant Adema, which is basically about how academic knowledge loses out to practical knowledge. And then later on, his friends explain to him that the university is outraged at the attention that the trial brought to them, and how he'd be an idiot to go through admissions this term. Even Ambrose is taking a term off. He struggles to find direction for his semester off and ends up running into Threpe, who shows him part of a letter from Mayor Elveron, the man who's basically the king of Vintas in all but title, who needs a performer with a gift for words. Kvothe immediately thinks the mayor will be able to help him search for the Aemir, and decides to leave the next day. Count Threpe composes his letter of introduction, and later Kvothe runs into Elodin on the stone bridge as he leaves town. Elodin says that they call leaving the university chasing the wind, and advises him to literally chase the name of the wind. Now something to note is that on the bridge, a strange dark-haired man walks by staring at him, which is important because this mysterious character appears again very soon. Kvothe then stops at Devi's. He leaves Rhetoric and Logic, his thief's lamp, his talon pipes, and Denna's ring as collateral against his current debt, so that he has enough money for his travels. Now Count Threpe pays for his boat ride and gives him a bunch of last-minute advice, and warns him about the 3 things all wise men fear: the sea and storm, a night with no moon, and the anger of a gentle man, which we know is attributed to Tekkim, the famous philosopher. Now at the docks, Kvothe notices the same suspicious dark-haired man who stared at him on the bridge earlier. He's one of the sailors going on the boat, and he carries a cloth-wrapped package. Kvothe says that his journey was eventful, but oddly he doesn't elaborate more than to say, "Several unfortunate complications arose during the trip. In brief, there was a storm, piracy, treachery, and shipwreck, although not in that order. Over the course of the trip, I was robbed, drowned, and left penniless on the streets of Junpei." Now, it's interesting that Kvothe skips over what would seemingly be a really interesting tale. But I do want to draw attention to this, because Rothfuss has said that he didn't cut out this part of the story to save space. He has his reasons, and he wants us to trust him. So I think there's going to be something revealed later on that Kvothe just can't reveal in the story yet. There's something very suspicious about that sailor, and then the shipwreck, and then later on the shipwreck was reported reported as all hands lost. So apparently Kvothe was the only survivor. I imagine he had to use some clever sympathy or something to have an advantage. Now there is a pretty big theory regarding this part and the treachery that happened and Count Threpe. It seems like Count Threpe is the one that betrayed Kvothe. And there's several clues for this treachery. First of all, we first met Threpe when he was in the company of Ambrose. Willem is suspicious of Threpe, and Threpe never really finds Kvothe a patron. Threpe is the one that sends him to Vintas and even pays for the voyage, which ends in shipwreck. And Threpe seems to be stalling Kvothe at the docks, waiting for that sailor to get on board the ship. He also happens to be the first that hears that Kvothe was killed. So anyways, I'm pretty sure Count Threpe actually works for Ambrose. And this is where I'm going to be ending part 1 of the summary. Now in part 2, Kvothe goes off to Vintas, and there's going to be a lot of exciting things happening, so I hope you guys stick around for that one as well. Now part 2, I might be posting a little bit later because I'm getting married very soon, and I'm going to be taking a little bit of time off from uploading. But as soon as I'm back, I'll get back to making these summary videos. Maybe you're watching in the future and they're all already up. Then you can just binge watch them all. Now these videos take a lot of time and effort. I try to get a lot of the small details in there, but there's probably things that I missed that might be important, so let me know in the comments. Also, if you want to help support the channel, then you can become a patron or a channel member. That's the best way to help me make these videos on a more regular basis, and I appreciate it so much.